Last Trip Home. The Disturbing Case of Sasha Samsudean, True Crime Documentary. Sasha Samsudean had never planned on going back. She had built a new life far from the place that haunted her, but now, in the darkness of the early morning, she found herself at the edge of it all. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The road stretched endlessly in front of her. Barely a sign of life. She glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing but the shadows of trees, thick and dense. The air felt heavy. The hum of the engine was the only sound, but even that seemed wrong. Too loud. Too constant. Sasha's mind wandered, pulling her back to the last time she'd been here. The house. Her childhood home. She could still hear her father's voice, sharp and angry. Could still feel the tension that had hung in the air. She hadn't thought of him in years. But something had drawn her back today. A message. A strange call. Her pulse quickened as she turned onto the familiar road that led to the house. It looked just as it always had, perched on the hill, shrouded in mist. The windows were dark, like empty eyes staring into the void. She parked the car at the edge of the gravel driveway. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle. The silence outside was suffocating. Sasha stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel. The cold air bit at her skin, sharp and unforgiving. She looked around. The trees loomed like dark sentinels. She hadn't expected the place to feel so wrong. The house seemed alive, breathing, as if it was waiting for her. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the door. Each step echoed through the silence. Sasha's breath was shallow, the cold air burning her lungs. She reached the door. Her hand hesitated above the doorknob. A shiver ran through her. The door creaked open, almost on its own. The scent of old wood and dust hit her immediately. A rush of memories flooded her mind, good and bad. But something else was there now. Something dark. A low, almost imperceptible hum in the air. She stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind her. She froze. Her eyes scanned the hallway, but there was no one. No sound. Just that strange hum. It was coming from upstairs. Her legs felt like lead, but she moved toward the stairs. Each step she took made the floorboards groan. Up and up she went, until she reached the top. There, at the end of the hall, the door to her father's room stood ajar. Sasha's throat tightened. She hadn't stepped foot in that room in years. But now it felt like she had no choice. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open. The room was exactly as it had been, frozen in time. The same old furniture, the same dusty smell. But something was different. Something wasn't right. There, on the bed, was a figure. A shape. Her heart skipped a beat. It was as if someone was waiting for her. But the figure wasn't moving. Sasha's eyes locked on it. And then, as if in slow motion, the figure shifted. A dark shape rising from the bed. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. It was tall. Impossibly tall. And its eyes were glowing, a dull, sickly green. Sasha's breath hitched. She stumbled backward, but her feet wouldn't move. The shadow took a step toward her. Closer. Closer. And then the voice. Her father's voice. Low. Chilling. You shouldn't have come back. The words felt like ice on her skin. Sasha spun around, desperate for the door. But it was gone. The hallway was gone. The house itself seemed to be swallowing her whole. She screamed. But no sound came out. The walls closed in. And then, everything went dark. Sasha's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded, trapped in her chest. Her hands reached out, grasping, fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of what felt like a wall. But there was no wall. Nothing. Just darkness. Absolute and suffocating. Her eyes strained, searching for even a hint of light, but the blackness seemed endless. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Was she still in the house? Had the walls really closed in? Or was this something else entirely? The silence was overwhelming. Then a whisper, barely audible, a faint rustling, like footsteps dragging across old carpet. Sasha's skin crawled. Her breath came quicker now, panicked. "Help me." The words barely formed in her throat, but she heard them, clear as day. A voice. Her father's voice. But it wasn't right. It was distorted, twisted, like it came from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Her legs shook, but she couldn't stop herself from moving forward. The whisper grew louder. A soft, agonized plea. "Help me, Sasha." She didn't want to move. But the voice, it pulled her in. It was as if she was no longer in control of her own body. The darkness shifted. A figure materialized in front of her. A figure she knew all too well. Her father. But his face was wrong.
Pale. Gaunt.
His eyes, sunken and hollow. They stared at her, unblinking, almost pleading. A cold sweat broke out across Sasha's forehead. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, his hand shot out toward her, grasping at the air. His fingers, long and thin, curled like claws. Sasha recoiled, stumbling back. But the space around her was shrinking. There was no escape. Her mind raced. Her father had been dead for years. Hadn't he? But the face, the eyes, the voice, it all felt so real. Too real. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, pressing in from all sides. She was suffocating. Suddenly, the darkness flickered. A brief flash of light. Sasha blinked, just for a moment. But when her eyes opened again, the figure was gone. And the darkness had receded slightly. She could see the outline of the hallway again. The faint light of the moon coming through a window at the end of the corridor. But it wasn't over.
Not yet.
There was something still lurking. She could feel it. The air grew colder. A shiver ran down her spine as she turned toward the moonlight. Something moved there. A shadow, low and slithering, crawling along the floor. Sasha's stomach lurched. The shadow stretched and contorted, becoming something human-like. It rose from the floor with an unnatural, jerky movement. Her eyes locked onto it. It was no longer her father. It was something else. Something worse. The creature smiled. A smile that stretched far too wide. Its teeth, sharp and yellow, gleamed in the moonlight. "Welcome home, Sasha." The voice was not her father's now. It was something deep and guttural. Something ancient. And it was speaking directly into her mind. "Get out or you'll never leave." Sasha's legs gave way beneath her. She fell to the ground, trembling uncontrollably. Her breath came in jagged gasps as she tried to push herself back against the wall. Her mind raced. Her father's warning, the strange call, the twisted figure, it was all connected. This place, this house. It had been waiting for her. But for what? What had followed her all these years? Her pulse quickened as the shadow creature took a slow, deliberate step toward her. With every movement, the temperature dropped further. The walls seemed to close in, pressing harder, suffocating her even more. She had to get out. There was no choice. Her body screamed at her to run, but her limbs felt heavy, like lead. Her throat burned with the need to scream, but no sound would come. The creature's smile grew wider, impossibly wider, until it seemed to consume its entire face. And then, just as it reached out to grab her, the floor beneath her cracked. A loud snap echoed through the house, and suddenly the darkness was gone. The creature was gone. The house was still. Sasha was alone. But she knew better than to think it was over. The silence was suffocating, thicker than before. Sasha's eyes darted around, searching the empty, dimly lit hallway. Her breath came in shallow gasps, still trembling. The darkness was fading, but something felt off. A buzzing sensation, like static, tingled at the edge of her mind. The house, no, something in the house was watching her. The air was dense now, as though the walls themselves had come alive, closing in on her with every breath. She couldn't shake the feeling. The whisper returned, faint but unmistakable, echoing in her ears. "Get out, now." It wasn't her father's voice anymore.
No.
It was something older, colder. A voice that made her insides twist, like an unseen hand was squeezing her heart. Sasha shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She had to leave. She had to run. Her legs moved, though they felt like they were made of lead. Every step felt like she was wading through thick, invisible mud. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. The light from the window at the far end flickered, casting eerie shadows against the walls. She reached the stairs. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight, the sound sharp in the dead silence. Each footfall felt like an eternity. Sasha reached the bottom, her eyes flicking to the front door. The front door. But something was wrong. It was closed. She hadn't closed it. It had slammed behind her, but now it was sealed tight.
Locked.
Her heart raced, panic rising in her throat.
No.
She was trapped. She backed away from the door, fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, rough wall. Her mind spun, desperate for an escape. The windows. She looked toward the windows along the far wall. But they were sealed shut too. Dark, solid glass. No way out. The walls closed in once again, that humming sensation growing louder, more insistent. Sasha's breath came faster, more frantic. The air had grown colder, so cold she could see her breath. It was like walking through the inside of a tomb. The weight of the house pressed against her chest, suffocating her. Then a soft thud from above. It was faint at first, like something heavy had dropped on the floor. Then another thud. Sasha's eyes snapped upward. The ceiling. Something or someone was moving up there. She froze, ear straining, listening for the next sound. It came again. A slow, deliberate movement. Heavy footsteps, dragging across the floor. Not human. Not animal. Something else. Sasha's legs were weak, but she moved anyway, backing up into the shadowy corner of the room. The house felt alive, like it had a pulse, a heartbeat, and it was growing faster, louder. The floorboards creaked above her, the sounds now unmistakably heavy, methodical. Closer. And then, ****. A heavy thud followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy falling. Sasha's body jerked as a door upstairs, her father's old room, slammed open. The shadow from earlier, the thing that had smiled, was now on the move, its shape growing and shrinking in the flickering light. She could hear its breathing now, raspy, guttural. Sasha's stomach churned. Her legs were screaming at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, oppressive air. It was right above her now. The footsteps stopped. And then nothing. A pause. The absence of sound stretched on. Too long. Too quiet. Sasha's pulse hammered in her ears. Her mouth was dry. Her chest was tight. It was waiting. Watching. She couldn't breathe. Suddenly, there was a sharp scrape across the floor. Something dragged. Heavy. It was coming down the stairs. Slowly. Relentlessly. Closer. Closer. Sasha felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She had to move. Her eyes darted toward the window again, but she didn't dare make a sound. She saw it then. A figure, tall and lean, emerged from the darkness at the top of the stairs. The same grotesque face, distorted and hollow-eyed. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It stepped down one slow, deliberate step at a time. Closer. Closer. Sasha's body jerked into action before her mind could even fully process it. She ran. She bolted toward the front door. Her hands reached out desperately. The door handle. It's locked. She screamed. The air thickened as the shadow crept closer, just steps behind her. And then, the door flew open. She stumbled outside into the night air. A breath of freedom. But something followed. A whisper in the wind. You're mine now. Her body froze. Sasha turned back. And the house, was watching. Sasha's legs buckled, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she staggered away from the house. The cold night air hit her skin, sharp, but it didn't bring relief. There was no escaping the sensation of being hunted. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, but she knew *** was still there, still watching. Her heart hammered in her chest. She glanced around, but there was nowhere to run. The woods surrounding the house stretched endlessly into the darkness, an unforgiving maze of shadows. Every direction seemed like a trap. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't stay here. Sasha spun around, looking at the old car still parked at the edge of the gravel driveway.
The car.
Maybe she could drive away. But her fingers trembled as they fumbled for the keys. Her mind raced with fear. She needed to get far, far away from this place. But she couldn't shake the feeling *** was coming for her. She had no choice. She had to leave. Her body was screaming at her to run, to get in the car, to leave. But, what if it followed her? What if the nightmare didn't end at the edge of the property? The sound of a creaking floorboard behind her snapped her back into reality. She spun toward the house again, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, nothing. Then the door. It opened, slowly, as if inviting her back. Sasha's entire body went cold. Something moved in the darkness of the doorway, something tall, thin, its outline just barely visible in the pale moonlight. It was waiting, watching. She could feel its eyes on her, even from here. The darkness around the door thickened. It felt like the house itself was breathing, exhaling a sickeningly cold gust of wind that made her skin prickle. Sasha's hand hovered over the car door handle. But she didn't move. She was paralyzed. A faint whisper rippled through the air. Come back, ***. The voice, it wasn't human. It was deep, thick. The words clawed at her mind. She couldn't fight it. Sasha stepped backward, not even realizing she was doing it until she was halfway toward the house again.
The driveway.
The car. Everything seemed so distant now, like it was part of another world. She couldn't leave. Not like this. Not until she understood. But she had no idea what she was even looking for. All she knew was the oppressive pull, like the house was beckoning her. Her feet were moving again, drawing her closer. The gravel beneath her boots seemed to crunch louder now, too loud a warning. Each step felt heavier, but it was too late to stop. She was moving toward the door. The wind howled again, but she couldn't hear it anymore. Only the voice, the presence that had never left, no matter how far she'd gone. The shadow at the door was growing, stretching like it had a life of its own. The eyes, those glowing eyes, stared at her, searching her, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Sasha stepped onto the porch, her fingers brushing the peeling wood of the doorframe. The shadow inched forward. And then it was there. There. Right in front of her. Its breath was like cold steel against her face. Her heart thudded against her ribs, frantic, suffocating. The creature reached out. Slowly, but not to hurt her.
No.
Its long fingers grazed her cheek.
Cold.
Too cold. She flinched, pulling away. But the creature's grip tightened on her arm, holding her in place. Do you remember? It hissed. Sasha's eyes widened. It was her father's voice again, but distorted.
Hollow.
Like it had been pulled from deep, dark places, far beyond the edges of reality. A sickening laugh echoed through the night air, rattling her bones. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight, her mouth dry. Her body was trembling uncontrollably. It was real. It was all real. You're mine now, the creature whispered again. Sasha struggled, but its grip held her tighter, dragging her forward. The door behind her slammed open with a deafening crash. The house seemed to breathe deeper, exhaling a cold gust that made her skin crawl. Everything around her blurred. The shadows warped and twisted like living things. And then she heard it. A voice, not her father's this time. A different voice, but familiar. Run. A sharp, desperate cry that pierced the suffocating air. It was her own voice. It echoed back to her. But before she could fully comprehend what was happening, the door slammed shut again. The house locked her inside. Sasha's breath caught in her throat. Her body slammed against the door with a force that almost knocked her breath out.
Locked.
The sound of the latch snapping into place echoed in the silence. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, each thud growing louder, more frantic. She clawed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The cold air in the room felt suffocating, and the walls, seemed to be closing in on her. There was no escape. She spun around, eyes wide, searching for any kind of opening, any way out. But the hallway behind her was empty. The shadows, though, they weren't. The darkness seemed to move.
To shift.
Watching. Her head spun, the pull of the house growing stronger with every breath. She had to get out. She had to.
But where?
Her feet were rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed with fear. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Someone was standing at the end of the hallway. A figure.
Tall. Thin.
The same twisted shape she had seen before. The creature. Its face was a grotesque mask of skin stretched tight over bone. Its eyes glowed a sickly green. It smiled again. Too wide. Too wide. You're not leaving, Sasha. The voice was deep, like the rumble of a distant storm, and it reverberated inside her skull. She froze. For a second, everything felt like it was suffocating her, drowning her in a sea of terror. It knew her name. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, gliding across the floor, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. Every step it took was deliberate. Slow. A pause between each footfall. Sasha's mind raced. She needed to fight. She needed to do something. But her limbs were frozen, heavy, as if her very body was betraying her. The air around her crackled with malevolent energy. The shadows seemed to twist and grow, creeping toward her, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. The thing was almost there now, standing just feet away. Its eyes never left hers. Why are you doing this? Sasha whispered, her voice barely audible. The thing's smile stretched even further. You shouldn't have come back, it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. You've always known the price. Sasha's stomach churned. The memories began to flood her mind. Her father. The house. The secrets she had buried so deep, even she had forgotten them.
No.
She had to fight. She had to get out. Her legs screamed at her to move, and she forced herself to take a step back. But it wasn't fast enough. Sasha wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere in the darkness, in that suffocating void, something changed. The air felt different. Still thick, but colder. Empty. And then a whisper, so faint it almost sounded like her own voice, came from the very depths of the house. Help me. Her eyes flickered open, but everything was blurry. The world felt wrong. Too wrong. She could barely make out the outlines of the room. But something was different. The walls, they were closing in again. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. There was no sound, just the endless, suffocating silence. And the thing, it was still there.
Still watching.
Still waiting. The house had claimed her. Sasha's mind felt like it was unraveling, the edges of her consciousness blurring as if she were slipping in and out of a dream. Her body was still paralyzed, frozen in place, yet every nerve was on fire. The suffocating silence around her seemed to press in, crushing her from all sides. But there was something else. Something new in the air. A shift. A tug at the very core of her being. She wasn't alone anymore. The house had changed her. She could feel it. The walls felt like they were closing tighter with every passing second, but she wasn't sure if it was the house, or if it was her mind warping everything around her. Her eyes darted to the far corner of the room. There, in the darkness, was a faint glimmer of movement. At first, it seemed like nothing, but then it grew. A shadow. A figure. Not the creature from before, but something else. A human figure. A person. Sasha's heart skipped in her chest, a wave of frantic hope crashing through her. "Help me," she whispered, though her voice felt distant, like it wasn't even her own. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, silent. But then, slowly, its head turned toward her. Sasha's pulse raced. It was a woman. A woman with hollow eyes, her face gaunt, her lips pulled back in a grim smile. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, tattered at the edges, as if she'd been trapped here for years, decades, maybe. Sasha opened her mouth to speak, to beg for help, but the woman's eyes locked onto hers, and the air around her froze. The woman took a slow step forward, her feet gliding across the floor, leaving no sound in her wake. And then she spoke. A voice that made Sasha's blood run cold. "You don't belong here, but you'll never leave." The words were soft, yet they vibrated in the air with an unsettling finality. Sasha's legs buckled beneath her, but the woman was already at her side, her cold hand reaching for her arm. Sasha recoiled, but the touch was unrelenting. A vice. It pulled her closer, dragging her toward the center of the room, where the floor seemed to ripple like water, twisting beneath them. "No," Sasha gasped, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Please no." The woman's face twisted into a grotesque grin, her eyes wide with an unnatural hunger. "You've already crossed the line," the woman said, her voice growing colder, sharper. "You're part of it now."
Part of the house.
Sasha tried to break free, but it was like her feet were glued to the floor, like the very foundation of the house had grown roots deep inside her, pulling her back. The woman's smile grew, her hollow eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. "You'll stay here, like the rest of us. Forever." And then the house reacted. The walls began to shake. The air crackled with static, heavy with energy, as if the house itself was coming alive, feeding on her fear. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Sasha like a thick blanket, closing in tighter and tighter until her body was consumed by darkness. She gasped for air, but the air was thick and suffocating. She could feel the walls of the house tightening around her chest, squeezing the breath out of her, as if they were trying to absorb her into the very fabric of the place. Her vision blurred, her body frozen in place, every part of her struggling, fighting for release. But there was no escape. The house had its grip on her now. The last thing she saw before her vision went completely black was the woman's face, inches from hers. Her eyes, hollow and endless, staring into her very soul. "You are mine now, asterisk." The voice echoed inside her mind, reverberating in the depths of her skull. And then there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. Nothing but the house. Sasha was lost. The silence in the room was deafening. Sasha's body felt weightless, as though she were floating in some inescapable void. She tried to move, but her limbs didn't respond, as if they had been severed from her will. The darkness around her pressed in, thick, suffocating, like it was part of her now. Her senses were overwhelmed, as if her very soul was being consumed by the house.
"You are mine now."
The words reverberated through her mind again, deeper this time, sinking into her very core. She had heard them before, but now they felt different. More final. More real. Her thoughts were slipping away, like sand through her fingers. But then, a flicker of light. A small, faint glimmer. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sasha focused on it, as much as her mind would allow. The light grew, slowly, as if beckoning her toward it. It wasn't the cold, suffocating blackness anymore. It was warm.
Alive.
She reached out, but her body felt like a stranger, heavy and uncooperative.
"Move, move."
The voice in her head screamed at her, urging her to take action. Her fingers twitched. Her legs shuddered. And then, finally, she moved. A slow, tentative step. The glimmer of light grew brighter. It felt like it was pulling her, calling her back from the brink of the abyss. Her heart pounded. Her chest tightened. Could she escape? Could she still break free? She didn't know, but she had to try. The darkness receded, just a little, like it was reluctant to let her go. The light grew stronger, clearer. She could almost see it now, a small crack in the air, a doorway that hadn't been there before. Her breath caught in her throat. She was moving toward it, almost instinctively, her body fighting against the overwhelming force of the house that clung to her. But the moment she moved closer, the floor beneath her feet shifted again, groaning like it was waking from some deep slumber. The ground trembled. The walls seemed to pulse. The house was reacting. It wasn't just an inanimate thing anymore. It was alive. Alive in a way that made her skin crawl. As she drew closer to the light, she heard it again, the whisper. "Where do you think you're going?" Sasha froze. The voice was deeper now. More hungry. The shadows on the walls stretched toward her, twisting like serpents. The light flickered, waning, as if the house itself was trying to swallow it. She had no choice but to move faster. She was so close. She could feel the warmth of the crack now, almost within reach. Her fingers brushed against the light. And then, the world erupted. A deafening, bone-shaking crack split the air, and the floor beneath her feet splintered, breaking apart like glass shattering. The light flickered one last time. The shadows clawed at her, pulling her back, dragging her into the endless darkness. For a brief moment, she felt weightless, as though she were falling into a deep abyss. But then something else. A presence. Something that wasn't the house, but still of it. Sasha's eyes snapped open. She was no longer in the room with her father's body. No longer in the house. She was in a place dark, but different. Empty, yet full. Like she had crossed some threshold. And then she saw them. Figures. Shapes. Some human. Some not. They hovered in the periphery of her vision, whispering, their voices blending into a low hum. They were everywhere. Sasha's pulse raced again, but this time, she didn't feel the suffocating weight of fear. She felt numb. She didn't know where she was, or what she had become. But she knew one thing for sure. She was still part of it. The house. It had taken her. And now, she was among the lost. Forever. The figures moved closer, some reaching for her with skeletal hands, others just watching, waiting. Sasha opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The whisper returned. Asterisk, you're one of us now. Asterisk. The darkness closed in, and Sasha was never going to escape. The darkness tightened around her like a noose, pulling her deeper into the void. Sasha's heart pounded, each beat like a drum, echoing in her chest. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but there was nothing she could do. Her body felt hollow, weightless, like it had ceased to matter. The figures surrounded her now, their faces twisted, their forms shifting in unnatural ways. They didn't speak, they just watched. Silent. Unblinking. As if they were waiting for her to understand something she had refused to grasp. Sasha's mind scrambled, searching for any way to escape this nightmare. But there was no way out. The house was everywhere now. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was this. It was them. The figures reached out for her with long, skeletal hands, their fingers brushing her skin. Each touch was like ice, a cold that seeped into her bones, spreading outward until she couldn't tell where their hands stopped and her body began. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes flicked to each figure, their faces blurred in the periphery, but the coldness, their coldness, was real. They were all dead, and she was becoming like them. Sasha struggled, but it was useless. There was nothing left to fight. The whisper grew louder, now a constant murmur in the back of her mind. You belong to us. The words reverberated through her skull, sinking deeper until they felt like a truth she couldn't escape. Her legs moved unbidden, involuntary, toward the center of the dark space. In the middle there was a shape, an object. It was too far to see clearly, but it was there, pulsing in the shadows like a heart, beating in rhythm with the house. Her feet carried her closer, though she had no control. Her body was no longer hers. It was the house's now. You belonged to it. The shape became clearer as she approached. It was a door she had never seen before, yet it felt familiar. It was an ancient, wooden door with iron hinges, worn and scarred by time. The figures stood behind her, their hollow eyes locked on her every movement. Sasha reached for the door handle. Her fingers brushed the cold metal. And the moment she touched it, everything shifted. The world twisted and turned, pulling her in all directions at once, until she felt like she was falling, plummeting into something so deep, so dark, that her mind couldn't comprehend it. The pressure was unbearable. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't see. Everything went black. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a flicker, a low, guttural groan. And the smell of decay, of something ancient, rotting in the dark. Sasha gasped, her body jerking upright. But it wasn't a gasp of air. It was a scream. Her voice was hoarse, ragged, as though it hadn't been used in years. She opened her eyes, but it wasn't the dark space she had just been in. It wasn't the house. She was in a room, an empty room. The walls were cracked and peeling, the floor covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. She was lying on an old, creaky bed, her limbs heavy, as though she had been asleep for far too long. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, her mind struggling to piece together what had just happened. Was it a dream? Had it all been a dream? But no. The weight in her chest, the pressure of something, told her otherwise. She wasn't alone. The room was still. But there was something there. She turned her head. Her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood at the foot of the bed, just beyond the edges of the shadows. It was tall, hunched, and its shape was unmistakable. The creature. The thing that had haunted her. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and its mouth was twisted into a grin. Sasha's heart pounded in her chest. "No," she whispered. But it was already too late. The figure moved forward, its presence filling the room. She tried to stand, to run, but her legs were unresponsive, like they were bound by invisible chains. "Did you think you could escape?" The voice was no longer distant. It was here, in the room, inside her head. The creature reached out for her, its fingers stretching unnaturally long. "You've already crossed the threshold." Sasha could feel its cold fingers brushing her skin, and she recoiled, but it was too late. The creature's grip tightened, pulling her closer to it. Her body shook, her mind screaming, but no sound came. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was her. She had become part of it. And she was never leaving. Her screams were swallowed by the darkness, the room spun around her, and the darkness seemed to collapse in on itself. Sasha's body lurched, fighting against the grip of the creature, but it was like trying to swim in molasses. Every part of her felt heavy, each breath harder than the last, as though the very air was thickening, turning into something that wasn't quite air at all. The creature's fingers were ice, and the touch of its skin sent a wave of cold coursing through her veins, freezing her from the inside out. "You cannot run," it whispered, its voice low and guttural, like the sound of gravel grinding underfoot. "You belong to it now." Her heart raced, but her limbs were no longer hers to control. Her body was a marionette, yanked on invisible strings by the thing that loomed over her. She could feel the weight of the room pressing on her, like the walls themselves were breathing, alive, pulsing with a rhythm she could almost hear. The creature's grin widened, stretching unnaturally, until it was nothing more than a jagged, gaping maw. It lowered its head to her ear, its breath freezing her skin. "You've always been part of it," it murmured, as if revealing a long-buried truth. "The house has always claimed you." Sasha fought against the numbness overtaking her, forcing her hands to move, forcing her body to obey. But it was no use. Her vision blurred as her thoughts began to cloud with the suffocating pressure of the house. She was no longer sure where she ended and the house began. The two were intertwined, connected in a way that went beyond the physical. The creature leaned closer, its black eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her insides twist. "You're not the first," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "Others have come before you. The house claims them all." Others. Sasha's mind flashed back to the woman in the nightgown, to the faces of the figures she had seen, their hollow eyes watching her as though they had waited centuries for her arrival. And then the realization hit her. They weren't just trapped. They were part of it. The house didn't just feed on fear. It absorbed souls. It claimed them, twisted them into its own image, until there was nothing left but its hunger. Sasha's breath hitched, and for the first time, she truly understood. The house didn't just want her to leave, it wanted her to stay. To become like them. A part of the endless, shifting darkness. She had been walking toward this moment from the very start. Her father, his empty eyes. The twisted corridors. The eerie whispers that had followed her back to this place. It was all a trap. And now, the house was tightening its grip around her soul, pulling her into the depths where she would never escape. "Let me go," she cried, her voice hoarse, weak, barely a whisper. But the creature only chuckled, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through her bones. "You have no power here, Sasha. You belong to it now." The creature's grip on her tightened further, and with a sickening twist, it dragged her toward the shadows that now consumed the room. Her legs kicked helplessly, but the force was unyielding. The shadows were alive, hungry, pulling at her skin, at her very essence. The floor beneath her seemed to collapse, disintegrating into an endless abyss. The darkness devoured everything in its path, swallowing the room, the air, the last shred of light that had dared to linger. And then, all at once, the room, the house, the world, vanished star. Sasha was falling into the infinite blackness. Her body weightless, her thoughts fragmented. It was as though she were being pulled into something deeper than the house, into something older, something that had no beginning and no end. The void. Her mind screamed, but there was no sound, no echo, just the relentless pull of the abyss. And then, in the distance, just as she thought she might be consumed completely, she heard it. A voice. It was a whisper at first, barely audible. But it grew louder, closer. And then, there was no mistaking it. "Help me." The voice was unmistakable.
Her own. Sasha gasped.
Her eyes snapped open, but she wasn't sure what she was seeing. The darkness had returned, but this time it felt different. The air was thick,
Heavy.
but there was something else, something lurking beneath it all. Sasha's hand moved slowly to her chest, and she felt it. A pulse. A heartbeat. And it was hers. But it wasn't hers alone. There was something else there, something pulsing in sync with her own heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed wrong. Her breath caught in her throat. The house was inside her now. It had claimed her, and she had no idea how to escape. And as the darkness closed in, she understood. It wasn't just the house that had been waiting for her return. It was the house within her. The darkness wrapped around her like a shroud, suffocating, endless. Sasha's pulse beat loud in her ears, but it wasn't just her pulse anymore. It was the house's heartbeat, too. A steady, rhythmic thrum that resonated in her chest, deep within her bones. She could feel it now, the way the walls of her own body seemed to shift, bending to the will of the house that had claimed her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening with each inhaled breath. The air was thick, impossibly thick, pressing in on her from every side. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her limbs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by the house itself. She tried to move, but her body no longer obeyed her commands.
Trapped.
That's what she was.
Trapped.
The house had claimed her soul, and now it had entwined itself with her being. The shadows around her swirled like smoke, forming shapes that she couldn't quite grasp. She saw flashes, figures in the dark, faces she didn't recognize. Some were twisted, their features contorted in agony, as though they had been trapped here for centuries. Others were still, lifeless, their hollow eyes staring through her, as though they had long ago given up any hope of escape. She tried to look away, but the figures seemed to draw closer, their shapes shifting in and out of the darkness. Their whispers were like a million voices, all speaking at once, overlapping and blending into an incoherent chorus. "Join us," they murmured. Stay here, Sasha's mind reeled, the whispers grinding against her sanity, tugging at her resolve. But she couldn't give in. She had to find a way out. She had to fight it. With everything she had left, she forced her legs to move, dragging herself forward despite the weight of the darkness that clung to her. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, but each one felt like an eternity. And then, ahead of her, through the swirling mist of shadows, she saw it, a door. A door she had never seen before. It was glowing faintly, the edges shimmering like it was made of pure light. Her heart skipped. The pulse quickened in her chest, urging her to run, to reach for the light. She moved faster, each step feeling like an impossible effort, but she didn't stop. Her fingers brushed the handle, and the warmth from the door flooded her body, a sharp contrast to the cold that had claimed her. She pushed the door open, and suddenly, the weight on her chest lifted. The darkness seemed to recoil, retreating into the corners of the room. Sasha stepped through, into the light. But what she saw on the other side made her blood run cold. It wasn't a hallway or another room. It was nothing. The void stretched out before her, an endless chasm, like the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the emptiness. She was alone. But she wasn't truly alone. The house was still there, asterisk in her star. A part of her. The same dark pulse thudded in her chest, and the whispers returned, louder now, filling her mind with the weight of their voices. "You're ours, Sasha." The words echoed, vibrating the very air around her. The cold seeped back into her skin, but this time it was different. It was familiar. She was the house, and the house was her. It wasn't just a place she could escape from. It had become a part of her existence. She couldn't escape it. There was no way out.
It was in her blood now.
And as the darkness closed in once more, there was only one thought that remained in Sasha's mind. There was no escape. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how far she ran, she was already lost. And the house would never let her go. The house had taken her, asterisk body and soul, asterisk. And now, it was home, the endless void stretched out before her, swallowing everything she had once known. Sasha could no longer tell where her body ended, and the darkness began. It clung to her, pressed against her like a second skin. The light from the door was gone. Now, all that remained was the cold, hollow pulse in her chest, the one that belonged to the house. She had been chosen, as had all the others before her. And she knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that she would never be free again. Her hands trembled at her sides, as though they still belonged to a body that hadn't fully accepted its fate. Sasha closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the darkness too much to bear. But when she opened them again, the world had shifted. The void was no longer empty. It was filled. Figures. Hundreds of them, swirling in the mist, moving like they were part of the air itself. Some were still just faces. Others still moving, trapped in endless motions, their forms stretched and distorted. They had been waiting for her, just as the house had been waiting. "Welcome," a voice whispered. It was her voice, but distant. Her mouth didn't move, but the words came anyway, asterisk familiar, yet foreign star. "Welcome to the house forever." Sasha's breath caught in her throat. Her limbs went numb, and for a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figures around her began to circle. Their eyes were blank, void of any humanity, their faces contorted in silent agony. She saw the woman in the nightgown again, the one who had first spoken to her. Her face was gaunt, a twisted mask of despair. She reached out, her long, skeletal fingers brushing Sasha's cheek. "You're one of us now," the woman's voice echoed, hollow and void of hope. "No," Sasha gasped, her voice shaking. "No, I can't. I won't stay." But the house didn't listen. The pulse in her chest grew stronger, faster, matching the rhythm of the house, until it was all she could hear, all she could feel. The house was her, and she was it. It was as if the very essence of the place had merged with her soul, twisting and corrupting every thought, every breath. Sasha tried to move, to break free, but it was no use. Her body was no longer hers to command. Her vision blurred, and the figures around her seemed to close in, their faces melting into the same distorted, twisted expressions. "You are home now," the voice whispered again, this time softer, as though it were soothing her. Her hands, though unsteady, reached out toward them, toward the faces that had once been human. The house had claimed them, and now it was her turn. "Join us," the woman said, her voice a soft lullaby now. And with that, Sasha understood. There was no escape, no fight left to win. She was part of the house, a piece of its endless hunger, a part of the endless cycle of souls that had been swallowed whole by its darkness. The figures around her reached for her, pulling her in, and she didn't resist. She couldn't. Her mind was gone, her soul swallowed whole by the house. The darkness, thick and endless, consumed her. And in that moment, she became the house. The coldness in Sasha's chest deepened. It was like her heart had stopped beating, replaced by a cold, empty thrum that echoed with the pulse of the house itself. She no longer felt fear, not like she had before. No more terror, no more pain. There was only stillness, a silence so profound, it filled every inch of her being. The figures, the lost souls, drifted closer, their faces flickering in and out of view, but they no longer mattered. Sasha was one of them now. Her eyes were hollow, her body weightless. It was as if she were floating, untethered from anything that once anchored her to reality. Her skin was cold, but there was no more feeling in it, no more sensation. The house had taken everything. It was no longer a place, a physical structure. It had become a state, a perpetual void, a cycle of endless hunger and endless souls. And Sasha was at the center of it. The whispers grew louder, a crescendo of voices that had once been her own. "Join us, forever." Her mind, once frantic, had quieted. The idea of resistance seemed absurd now. She had become part of the house, part of its vast, dark web of suffering. Her form melded with the others. She was one with the darkness. And then, just when she thought the void would consume her entirely, something changed. A soft crackling sound. A distant thump. The air around her shivered. A fleeting glimpse of light flickered in the blackness. No, she thought, her mind clouded. The light was too far away. But something pulled her toward it. The thumping, the faint crackle, grew louder. A distant bang echoed through the dark void, and it sounded familiar. The faint scent of old wood and dust filled the air.
A door.
A door was opening. A way out? Sasha couldn't comprehend it. She reached for the light, though her hands felt like they didn't belong to her anymore. The darkness tried to pull her back. She could feel it tugging, like something was holding her by invisible chains. But the door was there. It was real. The house was shaking now, its walls trembling with a low, guttural moan as if protesting her movement. Sasha stumbled forward, her feet dragging through the blackness. She didn't know if it was possible to escape anymore. But the door beckoned. The thumping, it was closer now, Sasha reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe. The cold metal of the handle felt warm under her touch, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Sasha felt something other than the house's pull. Her breath caught. This time, it wasn't just the house that whispered. It spoke in a voice that was familiar but cold. Leave. The voice was clear, a warning, but Sasha's hand still clenched around the handle. And then, the world around her shifted. She was no longer just floating in the void. The house around her screamed. It wailed in anguish, the sound of 1,000 tortured souls blending together into an unholy symphony. But the door opened, and Sasha stepped through. The light enveloped her in a sudden, blinding rush of warmth and clarity. She gasped, her lungs aching as if she had been drowning for an eternity. And then, in the blink of an eye, the light was gone. Sasha was standing in a hallway she had never seen before. The walls were familiar, lined with pictures, a soft glow emanating from the lamps above. She turned around, expecting to see the door she had just passed through. But there was nothing. Just the empty hallway. Her heart was racing. She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. The house, the darkness, had been left behind.
Had it?
She was breathing, really breathing. The air was thick but normal. She was free. Or was she? Sasha's heart pounded in her chest. The familiar sounds of the house, of the hallway, began to twist, distort, and for a fleeting moment, the walls seemed to shift. Her vision blurred. And then there was a voice. A whisper. So faint at first, she thought it was her imagination. But it came again, louder this time. You can never leave. The walls creaked. The floor beneath her feet groaned. Sasha turned, her breath catching in her throat. No, she wasn't free. The house was still there, inside her, echoing in every corner of her mind. Her pulse quickened, and as the walls seemed to close in, the truth hit her. She wasn't just inside the house. The house was inside her. Sasha stood in the hallway, the air heavy with a scent she could no longer place. Her heart raced. The walls felt like they were closing in, inch by inch, as if the house itself was alive, breathing. Her eyes darted back and forth, searching for the door, for the exit she had believed she found. But it was gone. Gone just like everything else. She could still feel the pulse, deep in her chest, thumping in rhythm with the house, as though it had become a part of her.
No.
She shook her head, trying to dispel the thought, but it clung to her like a shadow. The whisper came again, clearer this time, rising from the corners of the room. You can never leave, Sasha, Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but her mouth felt dry, her voice lost to the darkness. Her feet carried her forward, each step reluctant, like the house itself was pulling her along. The hallway stretched out before her, endless. The pictures on the walls, those familiar portraits she'd once seen in her childhood home, stared down at her, their eyes hollow, empty. They weren't just portraits. They were faces. Faces of people who had been swallowed whole by the house. Sasha's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel their eyes on her, as if they knew what she had become. The cold air turned even colder. She could see her breath now, a mist that swirled in front of her face. Each step she took, the house seemed to whisper, to beckon her further into its embrace. It was no longer just a place. It was inside her, around her, suffocating her from every direction. You can never leave. The voice had become a chant, a constant hum in the back of her mind. Her legs felt like lead, yet she could not stop moving. She reached for the door at the end of the hallway, a door that should not have been there. A door that she hadn't seen before. Her hand gripped the handle. The pulse inside her quickened. Sasha opened it. And there, waiting for her, was the house. The same house. But this time, it was more. It was a prison. And it had claimed her. Sasha stepped into the room, her legs unsteady as though the ground beneath her feet was made of liquid, shifting and unstable. The door creaked shut behind her, the sound echoing through the oppressive silence. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust, and something else, something ancient, something alive. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm, the same pulse that beat in her chest, the same pulse she had tried to outrun. She could feel it now more than ever, the weight of the house in her body, in her blood. Every step she took was a step deeper into it, a step toward acceptance. Her mind reeled, the fog of confusion lifting for a moment, only to be replaced by something darker, something more primal. The house was part of her now. She could no longer separate herself from it, no longer pretend that she could escape. There was no door that would lead her out, no way back to who she had been before. She stood in the middle of the room, the shadows swirling around her like living things, pulling at her, beckoning her to join them. And she knew, there was no running from this. The house didn't just claim bodies. It absorbed souls. And as she stood there, surrounded by the swirling darkness, Sasha realized the truth. She wasn't trapped in the house. She was the house. Her fingers twitched, her body still frozen in place. But deep inside, the part of her that was still Sasha, the girl who had once been full of dreams, full of hope, felt the last remnants of herself slip away. Her heart slowed. The coldness crept deeper into her skin, into her bones. The house was settling inside her, taking root. It had been patient. It had been waiting. And now it was complete. Sasha took one last look at the room, at the faces of the lost souls that had been swallowed before her, their hollow eyes staring back. And then she let go. She joined them. The shadows closed in, and the house absorbed her, body and soul. Her scream was swallowed whole by the walls, lost forever in the endless, eternal hunger of the house. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence. The house had claimed its final soul, and now it would wait for the next.